Until the turn of the century, British armed forces engaged in the removal of a group of their own people. People the military saw as a threat to its existence.
LGBT plus personnel matched the courage of their peers on the battlefield, but if discovered were arrested, interrogated, subjected to degrading medical examinations and court-martial.
Working with the charity Fighting with Pride, we're telling the stories of people who served or were directly affected by this gay ban. Our Fighting with Pride journey starts with Terry Skidmore, who was a member of the Household Cavalry for 5 years. Here he describes his experience of being confronted by senior officers of the cavalry and his subsequent dismissal, all because he drank in the wrong choice of pub.
And then I believe it was in January 76. The whole thing had then disappeared again. I had no idea what was going on. I was not on guard this particular day. I was working in the stables, and someone came to me and said, it would be an NCO, and said, "You're wanted up on the square." I had no idea what it was about. They didn't give me any more information. I'm just wanted up on the square. Okay, so I go up from the stables to the square, and I see this queue of men. There's a line of men on the square, on the parade square. People were going from the end of the line, from my right-hand side, and they marched across the square and up the steps, and then you didn't see them again because they'd go into the colonel's office, and then when they come out, they'd leave a different way. And when it was my turn, it was just one at a time. When it was my turn, I was marched across the square, up the steps, into the colonel's office. You go in and you salute and stand to attention because the man's a colonel. He had an entourage of people around him, other officers around him. I can't remember exactly who, but there would be the squadron leader and there was the quartermaster and things like this. There was about 4 or 5 other officers standing in a semicircle behind him. And I really can't remember what he said, but it was to do with where I was drinking and that my services were no longer required and my last day would be January, whatever it was. And he spun a piece of paper around on the table and told me to sign it. Now, look, at my age nowadays, I wouldn't sign anything unless I'd read every word, okay? But quite honestly, when you're that age and you're in front of a colonel and you don't really know why, he tells you to sign something, you just sign it. So homosexuality, as you know, was legalized in 1967, but the stigma was certainly still there in the 70s. I mean, some people are still twisted nowadays, but I mean, it's the stigma was there. So unless anybody ever, came into some bedroom somewhere and caught you in bed, I mean, how could anybody prove your sexuality? I don't know other people's sexuality unless they tell me. And you can sort of guess and make mistakes and all sorts of things. But because we weren't allowed to be gay in the army, or we weren't allowed to be openly gay, people didn't mention it. So I've always assumed now, it was based on an assumption that we were gay. Of course, we've come up against a brick wall because everybody says, "Oh, it's so long ago. All the records are gone. All the paperwork is gone. There's nothing to be found." Which is very convenient because there is no answer to it. There is no answer to what it was really all about. Obviously, many, many years have gone by. And if I never get an answer, if I go to my grave without an answer, that's just the way it's going to be. And I'm openly gay man nowadays with a boyfriend. And I mean, really, I haven't got any, I can talk about this because I've got no problems in Civvy Street, in the year 2021, I can talk about being gay. Where was the charge? Why wasn't I court-martialed? If I'd done something wrong, where was the charge? Why wasn't I court-martialed? Why did they give me a very good military conduct record? Why did they just simply say, "We believe he's got ability, but he's more suited to civilian life"? What the hell does that mean? And from that, we were denied a career. We were taken away from our friends. We were denied a pension. I mean, I've got a pension from a different company altogether these days, but we were denied a pension, which we would have had nowadays. And, yes, I suppose deep in me there is some pain, but I don't let it surface very often.
Next is Pauline Rimmer, who trained as a military policewoman in the mid-70s. Pauline's experience of don't ask, don't tell was standard practice.
So at 17, I was, and have remained, I guess, quite headstrong. And so when I went to Chichester to train as a military policewoman, it came as quite a shock to me that there was an emphasis at that time on catching lesbians. There didn't seem to be any similar kind of approach to gay men in the army. There was this situation where everybody knew that everybody was gay, or should I say, most of the women that I worked with were gay. But it was a question of, well, if you get caught, you know what the consequences are. So nobody will ask, and you just don't tell. Things came in waves, and you would know that the SIB were coming in, the Special Investigation Branch of the military police, and people would frantically dash about their barrack rooms, hiding letters, hiding photographs, taking down anything at all that could be construed as an indication that you were gay. I was discharged about 2 weeks before Christmas, 1977. And so spent Christmas in bed and breakfasts, looking for somewhere to rent. It was just, it was a very low time. I literally wandered the streets looking for work, sitting in cinemas, watching films, and then at 8 o'clock at night going back. Of course, I had no money. I left the army with my car and the belongings that I put in the car, because it was something that had happened very quickly. I had no money, I had no savings. And so I found myself literally living from hand to mouth for a short while. Because again, in the 70s, there wasn't the ability to do what we're doing now and talk on video and see people. You know, we were writing letters, and for a while I had no address that people could write to me at. So I was a bit of a lost soul, really, in the 70s after leaving the army. I'm very settled now. I'm very lucky that, you know, there are lots of people who haven't had the breaks that I've had to get on in life. But I still have a feeling inside. There's the 21-year-old inside of me still fears that everything can be taken away tomorrow.
Homophobia, shame, and personal secrets affected men and women in many areas of the military at all levels, regardless of rank, as Patrick Lister-Todd explains.
I served in the Royal Navy between 1972 and 1992. I joined as a midshipman and left as a lieutenant commander. And my role predominantly was as an executive branch officer. By the time I left, I was what was known as a principal warfare officer, and also command qualified. The hint of where I would have at least got to, I think, was in the fact that my next position was as second in command of a Type 42 destroyer. Who knows after that? I would have been very happy to have continued in my career as a lieutenant commander, but I would have hoped at least commander. My father made colonel, so who knows? In my first main warship on the train Strength, I became what was known as the confidential books officer, which basically meant that I looked after all the classified books and their upkeep, their security, but more importantly, all the crypto material, which was used to decipher communication. You would have to go through a full process of what was then called positive vetting, with a couple of referees, quite a pause whilst the vetting agency would carry out all sorts of research into your friends, then conduct an interview with you. They would go and interview your referees and their friends and their compatriots, and so on and so on. And the whole purpose was to ensure that you were not blackmailable by a foreign power. And of course, you know, I was living a hidden life, and technically, because it was a criminal offence to be LGBT plus in those days, I was blackmailable. From my perspective, I was nothing of the sort. I was a patriot. I believed in my job and in my country. I suddenly found myself unemployed for a year, and in the end, I lost the house. I was gazumped right at the last minute, ended up street homeless with enormous debt. A year, during that period, I had a breakdown, for want of a better word, and tried to take my life. I also, through a good friend and actually a chief executive of the UK's first LGBT charity, I should say joint chief executive, Craig Jones, together with Caroline Page, chair the first LGBT veterans charity, which is called Fighting with Pride. And that keeps me rather busier than perhaps I should be, but it's important work. The nonsense of it all was, and this was a key sort of point when we were later running a campaign to have this ban lifted on LGBT people, which was that the mere fact of you having to live the secret life was what made you blackmailable in the first case. You remove that and it goes away. And of course, that's what has happened. We won in the European Court of Human Rights in September 1999, and then only a few months later, in January 2000, had the ban lifted. There was no legislation required. It was a simple statement from the Defence Secretary, Geoff Hoon, in the House of Commons.
Our Fighting with Pride journey continues with Stephen Close, who served in the army for 3 years. As you'll hear, his experience was harrowing.
There was a group of us in this room. We was drinking most of the night, and these barriers started to fall down then between us. And eventually it came down. There was 3 of us in the room. One of them passed out. He was drunk and fell asleep on the bed. And then we started kissing with each other and fondling each other. And we decided to leave the room and go to another room. Unfortunately, the lad who we'd thought had fallen asleep hadn't. Then he decided to get up and go to the guardhouse and report me. We was taken to the medical examination. Well, the actual SIB officers ordered us to strip off naked, and they placed a piece of paper on the floor, like a rape kit. And as we took our clothes off, they bagged them, and then they wrapped the paper we stood on. They bagged that as well, and this was before DNA, so they took pubic hair samples, saliva samples. Then we had to lie on the beds while they looked up our backsides to see if we'd penetrated each other and all this. This was done with people actually watching outside the examination room. The doors were left open, and the sergeant medical orderly, he was stood at the door, and he was sort of giving a silent commentary to the people in the waiting room exactly what was happening. Military police went through my locker. They collected underwear, bedding, personal letters, photographs, everything. That was all bagged and taken away. Then we went back to the HQ where we was interrogated once again. And by that time, I was completely physically exhausted and completely broken. And that's when I admitted to it and confessed. We was treated with utter contempt, really. We was disgraced to the army. So we was relieved of all duties. I was rehoused in a disused part of the barracks, what was falling down, really. I was completely isolated from the rest of the battalion. I was beaten up a few times. I was sexually assaulted, but I couldn't report it because they just washed my hands of me. They was disgusted me. I think it was worse than espionage if it was actually found out. Then when the court martial eventually came, we had no legal representation. I asked for legal representation, and he said, no, it's an army matter. You'll be appointed an officer who will represent you. I think the officer had just come out of Sandhurst. He'd not even been in the army 6 weeks. He didn't say a word in the court case whatsoever. It was just all the prosecution. Nothing was put forward on my side. It was like, say, it wasn't up until like 2013 when Alan Turing got his pardon that people started saying sorry or acknowledging that it was wrong. But I've never had an apology from the government. I'm still proud. I still go to Remembrance Sundays and things like that, but I don't class myself as a former soldier. I do class myself as a soldier who was kicked out of the army for being gay.
Stephen's story is not unusual. In fact, as you'll hear, far more common than you'd think. Elaine Chambers' professional and private life came to an abrupt halt as her personal letters and diaries were read. As you'll now hear, it wasn't just Elaine's life that was negatively affected.
My rank was private initially while I trained to be a nurse in Queen Alexandra's Royal Army Nursing Corps. By the time I left, I was a lieutenant and a junior sister, as I'd successfully applied for and obtained a commission. Excited, nervous, proud, and yeah, it didn't take very long to realise it was absolutely the right choice of career for me to have made. I'd started out on a short service commission of 3 years, but I already knew I wanted to apply for midwifery training, and I already knew that the amount of time it would take to wait to get on the course, do the course, pay back double the length of the course time that you would owe for the army having paid for your training would have taken me very close to the end of my maximum 8 years that you could do in short service commission. And my plan would have been to have applied for a regular commission, and that would have allowed me to serve until the age of 55. I had a very clear career path marked out as far as I was concerned. Looking back, with the wisdom of hindsight, it was entirely that simple. It was sheer, utter bad luck of something being, a flippant comment being made quite innocuously, leading to an absolute disaster, not only for me, but for numerous other people who got caught up in the web because of my letters and diaries having been taken. My own investigation, it seemed after the first massive set of questioning that it shifted because they knew I was not guilty at all of the allegations against me, which were horrific. And although they never translated into charges, they had enough evidence from my letters and diaries and me being brutally honest with them, as I'd been legally advised by a military legal person, to get rid of me because of my homosexuality. And that in itself in the military then was to make you criminal. You were a criminal just for your existence, never mind anything you may or may not have done. So I knew my career was over. But when they took away my letters and diaries, then they widened the net and they went and investigated friends around the world and threw them out, people who weren't even involved in my case in any way. There's a possibility to actually put right now those wrongs from then, because ostensibly to people who weren't involved, you would look at it and you go, oh, for God's sake, stop whining. You got your compensation, you went to court, the ban was lifted, people can serve freely now, isn't it all lovely? You should all be happy. But the fact of the matter is, we were treated abominably by the Treasury Solicitor of the Ministry of Defence for those 14 years. And, the compensation was derisory. The way in which they worked out how much to compensate us was, frankly, the most insulting so-called formula I've ever seen in my life. So, yeah, there's still stuff to be done. And I think it would be wonderful if, groups like Fighting with Pride and, any of the other military support groups who back in the day didn't particularly support us and weren't particularly welcome. So although we were veterans, the fact that we were LGBT veterans meant we couldn't go to some of the places we would traditionally have gone to. And it's changing, thank God. You know, there are now LGBT branches in the Royal British Legion. Things are changing. There is an awareness that, you know, we have as much right to support and services as any veteran. And that's brilliant. So yeah, you know, there's definitely a case to be answered, and they could still do something wonderful to just help kind of soften the difficulties and the hardships of all those many, many, many years.
Carl Austin Behan OBE now tells an incredible story of his time in the RAF and his subsequent work to highlight the plight of the LGBTQ+ community in the British forces.
And unfortunately, I was on a crew with 7 other people, and we had an aircraft crash at RAF Chivenor where a Hawk aircraft crashed onto the runway. The first one had managed to eject. The second person was still trapped in the aircraft. And then I managed to straddle on top, but the aircraft was still fully armed. It was fully fueled. There was things ricocheting off. Managed to get the pilot out because of the fact that, you know, it was a live ejection seat. Basically, I was sat on top of a bomb. I ended up getting the British Humane Society Bronze Award for bravery. I went to Henlow, did a load of charity work, did London Marathon a couple of times, went to Ascension Island. And when I was in Ascension, I got involved with the CSC shows. I ended up getting a mention in the Queen's Birthday Honours list in '96 with the Commander-in-Chief's commendation. Even though I'd only been in the Air Force for 6 years at the time, every year that it was possible where I had my appraisal, I was getting 3 9s and spec rec every time, which was unheard of, especially in that period of time. In the January, I just got my papers through for my promotion and to get posted to Avcent, which was in between Belgium and Holland, dream posting. I then signed up for 22 years, but then the lad that I'd started seeing, he then phoned the Air Force and told them that I was gay, because he thought that would just mean that I wouldn't get posted away. He didn't realise the consequences that I'd actually get discharged. So then I got phoned up. I remember going to PSF headquarters. I was in there with OC admin. I was there with the Padre and also with the RAF police. And they just sat me down and it was like, SAC Austin, do you have homosexual tendencies? And I paused, and even though I knew the question was coming, they started to ask me again, and I just burst into tears. When I burst into tears and then explained myself, I think it completely threw them. They did explain to me that I could have gone to military prison for 6 months, but they were going to suspend me for 6 months based on the fact of my exemplary RAF career. You know, when you think about it, you know, I lost everything in that split second. I lost my career, I lost my job, I lost my friends, I sort of lost my family in a way, because they basically gave me 10 minutes to go off camp, and I was marched off by the RAF police. I was given 3 boxes and told to throw my stuff in the boxes, and I literally was shown off camp, couldn't say goodbye to anyone, couldn't, you know, again, we didn't have any phones or anything like that, so I didn't even get a chance to say goodbye to anyone or even clear my work locker. So then I literally drove out the camp gates. I remember there's a lay-by right outside the camp gates at RAF Honington, and I sat in that lay-by for about 3 hours, just crying my eyes out. So I ended up writing to Tony Blair. I wrote to the MOD. I wrote to my MP in Manchester, Graham Stringer, at the time. And basically, they actually sent me my records, and they also sent me. It was restricted, but they sent me a copy of the report they did. And my report, if you read it, it was just, you know, it was perfect. I couldn't have wished for anything nicer to be written about me. It was down to the government. They've not sat in Parliament to have this discussion. And as far as they're concerned, that I was incompatible to service life, because homosexuality is not acceptable within the armed forces. So due to being a homosexual, the dismissal stands. So I'm more offended by the word homosexual than queer, faggot, any other word, because it's written in a derogatory term and it's written against me. But I think with that and with reading it, it made me realise it had nothing to do with the armed forces. The ban could have been lifted and it could have been sorted by the government at the time and subsequent governments since up until 2000.
All the real-life experiences in this video make difficult listening. However, Dave Tovey's recollections are particularly tough.
At the time, was serving as a chef attached to 3 para and 1 para. And anyone who knows the military they are quite hardcore battalions to be attached to. I was absolutely petrified about people finding out about my sexuality. Don't get me wrong, they were an amazing battalion to be attached to, but that's when they see you as one of them. And if suddenly you then come out as not one of them, as a queer person, I'd probably, it would have been hell. It would have been one of the worst things, and probably would have caused me even more mental health problems than what I actually went through subsequently. Because I knew that something wasn't right, when there was sort of like manly sort of activities and stuff like that, I'd always volunteer. So it was sort of like putting that mask up. And I did this boxing competition. I had to lose a lot of weight because of it all. And then I got attached to the Princess of Wales Royal Regiment in Canterbury to go to Kenya. Because I was really, really skinny out of there, one of the sergeant majors out there, I think he just didn't take a liking to me, and he started to sort of like call me syndrome, as in AIDS victim syndrome. And because I was thinking everything what was going on in the country, newspapers vilifying gay people and stuff like that, I was petrified. I hated the fact that I was starting to feel that I was queer, and you know, and it shouldn't have been like that. It's not fair that I've had to have this doubt about my sexuality my whole life because of government and tabloid abuse at a time when I was so confused and trying to figure myself out. Because I made a silent movie about HIV awareness, where I went around London with sandwich boards with statistics of HIV and AIDS, and I mixed that in with photography from my life, from when I was a baby to the last photo that was taken before I was diagnosed with HIV. And my instructor was like, this is so personal, brutal, but beautiful, that I see this is the type of work that you have ownership in. You're so good at it. Then decided to make Unknown Soldier. It was me telling the world, I suppose, that all my inner darkest secrets, from the suicide attempts to my terminal illnesses, my hate of who I am, my diagnosis, etc., my sexuality, everything is all in this film. I was really, really lucky that several times for people to save my life, and I think this is what I mean about all these barriers and people there to knock you down, but there's always those really special people to pick you up. Sorry.
Tamsin Wakeham continues to enjoy a successful career in the RAF. Tamsin describes how she went from a career high through to depression, heavy drinking and shame following an investigation into her private life.
So I remember being in work, I was air traffic at the time, and I remember being called in by my boss who said, there's been these accusations against you and they want to talk to you. The police want to talk to you. So it was all obviously known, it was all going on in the background, but I just got the cold hand on my shoulder on the day. So I was escorted, couldn't go on my own. They wouldn't allow me to go on my own in case I did anything on the way or got rid of any evidence. And they had it all set up. So they asked if they could search my room. I sort of said, well, no, I don't see why you need to search my room. And they said, well, we already have permission from the station commander. So, I mean, it was all done already. And I remember walking down to the corridor once, walking down the corridor, and somebody was heading to the showers. They had their bathrobe on, and they literally sort of squeezed themselves up against the wall and walked past me and sort of looking at me like in disgust to make sure I wasn't looking at them. And I was just sort of like, oh my goodness. But that's the type of reaction you were getting. So yeah, really isolating. So, you know, from having, you know, doing really well and coming out top of my air traffic course and winning an, you know, award for, you know, sort of being brilliant, all of a sudden, I'm now, you know, because of who I may have chosen to, you know, be with in the comfort of my own room, now is becoming an issue. And then, so yeah, so the drinking, the unhappiness, the sort of self-loathing, the guilt, the shame, all starts piling on top of you. So it's not a pleasant place to be. When you've got people sort of pointing the finger, and it was almost at a party, and you're drinking so much, and I just didn't care really if I lived or I died at that point. Quite happily could have drunk myself to death. Yeah, that's probably the low point. It wasn't until I sort of stepped away from the alcohol. But I was fortunate that I left when I wanted to leave, and I came back in when I wanted to leave. And I know there's loads of people that didn't have that. You know, I went through the investigation, which was horrific in those times, but I managed by the skin of my teeth to keep my job. So I left on my terms. So I think that you know, I suppose I left on good terms. So that's why it felt okay to come back in. I loved it because I loved my job and I loved the people, but I didn't like that hiding yourself. So I left because I couldn't cope with not being true anymore. But I loved it. You know, it is a great job. You get, you know, you got so much opportunity. So I was out for about 5 years, and I looked at wanting to rejoin, and I'd become a firefighter, and I'd become an emergency medical technician. I'd done all these crazy things, but I still wanted to be aircrew. So I sort of was throwing it out there. What shall I do? Came back to the UK, and 2 days after I sort of thrown it out to the university to give me a sign, I saw it on the news, the ban has been lifted. And I thought, well, there's my sign. I rejoined because I had enjoyed the people and the opportunity. All I ever wanted when I served was to serve really well, wanted to do my job and not lose it, because I'm sure there's plenty of, you know, straight people who do crazy things behind their closed doors. Don't take my job away from me for what I choose to do, because I'm not breaking the law. So I think now it's nice to go to work and know that I can just work. You know, I mean, you think, wow, I've come from a girl, little 19-year-old who was nearly booted out, to here I am stood in the House of Commons for the same reason. So you're here, you're nearly out because you're a gay woman, and here I am stood in the House of Commons, you know, chatting to sort of Johnny Mercer and various others because I'm a gay woman. I mean, it's madness.